anybody been to all 4? Doing this again next year. We're already starting that schedule. We'll go a little bit over that later. But today, we're excited to announce our final speaker today, our State Auditor, Nicole Galloway. Before we get started, we can't do these without our sponsors. Dave Griggs has stepped up. Dave Griggs Flooring America has stepped up for the last 2 years and helped sponsor this program for the Chamber and for our members and for you. So, Dave, please help me welcome Dave and thank him.
Matt always gets very nervous when he says that. Anyway, I want to welcome everyone here. Obviously, I think everybody in this room knows that being engaged in our government is critical. We have a guest speaker today who's worked in the county government and did a great job and has gone on to much bigger and better great things. So I think you'll find Nicole extremely interesting. Just want to call your attention to, and I had to show this to Matt, embarrassing. The Chamber's, one of the goals is be the voice of business, and objective number 2, to promote an engaged community on business issues, which is exactly why we're here. Obviously, our county government and state government play a great role in everything that happens in Columbia virtually. So thanks again for coming, and we're proud to sponsor it, and we're on board for next year, sure, assuming that Matt approves. And
yeah, we're done. That one's easy.
Oh, that's all yours.
Real fast before we get rolling, I also want to thank one other, Matt Williams. Thank y'all very much. Landmark was our catering sponsor today. They provided the food also, so appreciate them. Now, introduction. Our Missouri State's Auditor, Nicole Galloway, is our 38th Auditor of the state of Missouri. Auditor Galloway believes government's, I'm going to read this so I don't screw anything up. I want to get it right. Auditor Galloway believes government's purpose is to serve the citizens it represents. In her role as State Auditor, she serves as the citizen's advocate, making sure government at all levels is efficient, effective, and transparent. She brings her expertise to work for Missourians each day, to be strong, independent watchdogs holding government accountable. Since taking office, she has placed an emphasis on identifying fraud in government and holding those responsible accountable. In addition to being a certified public accountant, she is also a certified fraud examiner. Prior to becoming state auditor, Galloway worked in the private sector as a forensic auditor and accountant with a focus on identifying corporate fraud and waste. She has a master's of business administration from the University of Missouri and a degree in applied mathematics and economics from Missouri University of Science and Technology in Rolla. Please help me in welcoming our very own Columbia, our state auditor, Nicole Galloway.
All right, well, thank you for allowing me to be here today. And all right. So, I mean, it's great to be here with so many faces that I know, to meet people that I maybe have not had the pleasure of spending time with before. And, you know, I've always viewed, you know, coming from my time in county government, you know, I viewed the Columbia Chamber of Commerce as a very strong advocate for this community, extremely well organized with a consistent voice on the needs of the community. And it is true that you do work very well with your local community leaders, your county leaders, and your state leaders. And not all chambers enjoy that type of coordination relationship. And so that's something that I know that takes a lot of work, a lot of maintenance. And so I applaud you on your efforts to do all of that. You know, I am someone that proudly calls Columbia home. I've lived here for a long time, live in the old Southwest neighborhood, live here with John, my husband, who works for Veterans United, as probably everybody in this room knows somebody that works for Veterans United. I happen to live with one. And we have our son, William, who is 5, Benjamin's 3, and Joseph is about 4.5 months old. So as you can see and know, we have very strong roots in this community. You know, I first got into public service as treasurer in Boone County, partially because I wanted to use my private sector experience that I had working as an actuary and as an auditor in the public sector. So using my private sector skills as a CPA to make the community around me better. You know, my background is just a little bit different. Previous to being treasurer in Boone County, I was an auditor at Shelter Insurance, and you know, grew to really love Columbia's business community in that position as well, so directly, because they're really involved and have, you know, really care about the community that we're that government at all levels should be transparent and responsive to the needs of citizens. In my role as state auditor, I am very proud of the work that we do. I am the only independent watchdog that holds government accountable, rooting out waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement. Just in the past 2 years since taking on this position, we've identified more than $130 million in government fraud, waste, and abuse. We hold the very powerful accountable to you, the citizens in this state. When we find theft of taxpayer dollars, that evidence helps put corrupt public officials out of office and sometimes behind bars. Because of my audits, 30 different criminal accounts have been brought against 11 public officials. Now, I audit Democrats, I audit Republicans, right? That's my job. I am tough, fair, and thorough because I truly believe in the role of state auditor. That's what people want out of the only independent watchdog that our state has. Throughout my time in public service, I share many of the same goals that you have here. I want great schools, good roads, strong economic development, a good business community so we can grow our state and put it in the right direction. Now, I know when people think of an auditor, they think of a fiscal watchdog. And it's important that someone in state government is independently looking out for taxpayers, making sure that every dollar you send to Jefferson City is spent wisely. And as we have seen in the news and sometimes felt in our communities, lawmakers haven't always made the wisest decisions with your tax dollars. And we have a significant budget hole that we're working to plug next year. About $500 million is being taken out of the budget next year. Now, my budget integrity series is a series of audits that examine the policy decisions that brought us to this point. We're looking at tax credits, tax exemptions, entitlement spending, and the preparation of fiscal forecasts that lawmakers use during the legislative process. Now, I came from the private sector, as you know, and so I understand that we need a good business climate here to grow jobs. But we need to independently measure how well we've done that through the goals of the legislature and policymaking and tax policy and the budget. We're also taking a hard look at the tax burden. Now, tax burdens are increasingly being pushed to local governments and the local community to fund schools and other economic development priorities. Now, one issue that I have brought to the public's attention is micro-taxing districts. So I released an audit of transportation development districts, or TDDs. And essentially, the law allows developers to set up, charge, and collect sales tax without a vote of the people. We found that Missouri taxpayers are on the hook for nearly $1 billion in outstanding project costs that they are not even aware of. Now, I've called for a legislative fix that would bring greater transparency and accountability to this taxing system. The bottom line is that budgets isn't just phantom numbers on a piece of paper. There are working Missourians behind every dollar and communities and families impacted by the decisions that the legislature makes. And that's something that we know very well here in Columbia. Now, last year, I released an audit of the funding and affordability of higher education. I found that we're 43rd nationally in state support for higher education on a per-student basis. We know from our audit that a decrease in state funding for higher education means families have to bear more of the burden and more of the cost. Even after saving for years, you're still taking out debt to send your kids to school so they can have a better opportunity. This year, the governor cut $83 million from the higher education budget, and next year, it's about $122 million that has been cut from the higher education budget. You know just as well as anyone else how important a skilled workforce is. Companies will tell you often that their fiercest competition is for skilled and trained workers more than it is for customers. Now, obviously, our institutions have to maximize efficiency and address questionable spending. I'm sure that you saw the audit of the University of Missouri system that we also released earlier this year. And we found about $2 million in bonus payments that were paid to executive staff and administrators that were not publicly disclosed. Now, to be clear, it's not just tax laws that I am concerned with. There are significant spending obligations as well. And let me give you an example. My office is currently auditing the Full Expense Fund. Now, question that I always get on that one. This is the pool of money that is used to make payments stemming from lawsuits against the state. So the state is spending more and more money to settle these types of lawsuits for inappropriate activity, including mistreatment, sexual harassment, on-the-job discrimination. These payments are essentially undefined in the current budget process, but the payouts have ballooned in recent years. My audit is still in progress, but recent reports show that this state has paid more than $50 million over the past 5 years. And I'll micro-target that for just a second for you. So the Department of Corrections, that's something that has been in the news across the state, issues within the Department of Corrections. Alone, that has cost taxpayers nearly $8 million over the past 5 years, a very sharp increase from the $340,000 paid the 5 years prior to that. So clearly, that is a huge jump. We have a huge problem that we need to address. In addition, we have the rising costs of healthcare, prescription drug costs, social services, just to name a few. In all of those areas, I will also be reviewing as part of this Budget Integrity Series initiative. Now, here's my philosophy. Let's figure out where we've gone wrong before we repeat the mistakes of the past with Missourians' money. Let's independently look at the legislature's policy choices now that they're being measured dollar for dollar against what's being pulled out of your community in school funding dollars or repairs to roads and to bridges. Those are the types of questions that I expect these audits will ultimately shed a light on. Budgets are about priorities, and how we prioritize reveals what we value as a state. But first, we need facts, right? Policy decisions should be driven by real data and not politics. The role of the auditor is to demand accountability. Missouri has a balanced budget requirement, but we have not really budgeted that way on the front end to avoid cuts later on in the process. Ultimately, policymakers must be accountable for their decisions. The audits included in the Budget Integrity Series will benefit taxpayers, ensure that Missourians' hard-earned dollars are spent wisely. Thank you for allowing me to be here, and I wanted to keep these remarks pretty brief so I could open it up to any questions that you all might have. Yes, sir.
Nicole, can you talk for a minute about enforcement? And as auditor, you don't really have the authority to enforce any of the findings that you come up with, yet you're talking about criminal charges that result from some of your audits. What are some of the things that could, give your audits more teeth, for lack of a better way to put it?
Sure. So it is correct to say that the auditor's office is not a law enforcement office, right? We do not make criminal determinations of violations of law. We don't, arrest people and, bring charges against them. But what we can do is work with law enforcement at every level, whether it be the FBI or the Attorney General or the local prosecuting attorney, Highway Patrol, on and on. And so when we are in the course of an audit and we find potential violations of law, we reach out to the appropriate law enforcement agency and work hand in hand with them through the process. That's where we have the 30 different criminal charges brought against those public officials. Now, previous to this legislative session, there was kind of a hole in that collaboration because even if, let's say, the local sheriff or the local prosecuting attorney knew that a clerk was stealing money from a municipal government, we don't have the discretionary authority to audit municipal governments. There has to be a petition of the citizens to request us to come in. There has to be a governor's request or something of that nature. So even if they knew there was fraud and theft, they could not call upon us to help do a forensic audit, which is a specialty. It's a different type of investigation rather than what you might typically find in criminal activity. I'm thankful to say that we worked with local prosecutors across the state to pass a fix to this in the current law. So it is passed, it has not been signed, but if this legislation were to be signed, then law enforcement at the local level could request the auditor to come in and do a forensic audit to help catch some of these instances, or to use our specialty to help them in their investigation. So we've had many cases of this where we've had to, say, we don't have the statutory authority to do this, we cannot help you there. And so that really strengthens our ability to hold folks accountable for criminal activity and behavior. The last thing that I'll point out is that while we do find criminal violations of law, I mean, we do find clerks just stealing money, we find it. So much of what we focus on, we want folks to put in policies and procedures in place, so if something bad happens, they can prevent it, doesn't have the opportunity, or they can detect it right away. Those kinds of internal controls and segregation of duties that you all have in your businesses, large and small, are not super exciting, right? These are the super boring findings that we have over and over again across the state. But I'm very passionate about this because I have seen from my time in the private sector and in this job that when you put those checks and balances in place, you prevent a lot of bad behavior. And we have a rating system. So if somebody is rated a poor, the lowest on the rating scale, meaning they did not do well at all and they have some immediate things that they need to fix, we will do a follow-up audit to make sure that corrective action has been taken, again, to prevent the bad things happening with your tax dollars. Yes?
Can you talk about what perhaps might be phase 2 of the cybersecurity audits in Missouri schools?
Sure. So we did a cybersecurity audit initiative in schools. And so we picked 5 school districts across the state to look to see how they were protecting the personal information of students, families, faculty, and staff. And so we have completed those 5 audits. And what it told us, and we picked from different parts of the state, Boonville was one, we had in St. Charles and Platte County, and Cape Girardeau, and then Waynesville as well. And so what we found is that there was a variety of attention paid to information security, sometimes just depending on the knowledge or the resources. So much can be done, again, talking about those preventative measures, so much can be done that is low-hanging fruit, like having passwords on your systems or changing your passwords every once in a while. Some of those core things that we just find over and over again that local government agencies aren't doing. And sometimes it really is just a lack of knowledge. So after we did those 5, I always said we were going to take a pause, right? We're going to kind of look to see what we have. We put together a compilation report, and we have worked with School Board Administrators Association, different education associations to try to educate them on the things that we were finding and the trends that we have seen. One thing we had is also a next step in this was legislation this year because that unfortunately did not make it across the finish line. But you may not know that if your school has a data breach, they have no requirement to inform you that your kid's information has been compromised. And we found this during our audits. And so we put forward a legislative solution to say that if your kid's information is compromised, we're going to have to tell you about it. That unfortunately got kind of caught up, as many pieces of legislation did at the end of the session, so I know what we're going to be doing next year already. I have a legislative priority already. And then kind of the final thing to follow up is that we will do another round on a smaller scale of information security audits at the school district level. But we haven't determined that yet. We're kind of waiting to see what happened in this legislative session and to follow up on that. This all started, I have kids in public school here in Columbia, but we did an audit of the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, DESE, and found that they were transmitting and storing millions of kids' social security numbers that they did not need for any business purpose. And we have to realize, and again, just like you guys know in your businesses, you put in systems back in 2008, 2006, it is a very different world now than it was 10, 15 years ago when you've implemented these systems. We need to say, do we really need the social security number every single time when there's a student ID number that we can use instead? What kind of updates and controls do we need for these systems? And so that's really what started this drive towards student information security at the school district level.
Hi, as a resident of Boonville, Missouri, where can I find that report?
It is online, as it is with every single one of our reports. So if you go to auditor.mo.gov, just our state auditor website, there's a report section, and you can find it in schools. Oh, that's great, thank you. Yeah, or you can click on the county. You can click on the county as well, and then everything from that county will pop up for you.
Okay, thank you, Nicole.
Eric, would you take a moment and share with us, since you've been in office, has there been some areas that you really wanted to investigate and haven't had a chance to do that, or do you have a number of priorities that you'd like to see come forward in the next couple of years while you're in office?
Sure. You know, I think cybersecurity was kind of my first priority. You know, modernizing state government and making sure, again, that people's personal information at every level of government is secure, and kind of touch upon that in one specific example. The other direction that I wanted to go in, talking about modernization and using technology, is using data analytics and big data. So when I worked in the private sector, we used this thing called ACL, Audit Command Language. I don't know if anybody knows what it is. But anyway, you can use big sets of data and write programs to do analytics on them, do comparative analysis. It is a way better tool than, like, let's say Access, right? It's designed specifically for this. And so we had some folks that were hired years and years and years ago that were brought on to do this kind of work, but kind of got sidetracked into more typical performance auditing. Well, we have reactivated what we're calling the data team to use big sets of data across the state. And what we can do there is take a broader picture of what's happening within an entity. And, you know, state government is a huge animal, and there is a lot of data out there. And so being able to connect the dots from a database housed within Medicaid to something that's happening over in, let's say, Department of Finance, you know, and marrying those two things together to do analytics and coming up with areas of potential fraud, areas where there needs to be more preventative measures or detective measures in place at the agency level. And so we are embarking on all of that. And to me, that is incredibly exciting. Again, it's a way to modernize the auditor's office using some of that private sector experience that I have and applying it in the auditor's office.
Hey, Nicole, this is partly a question because of my own ignorance of the organizational chart of the state. Like, who sets your audit schedule, and then to whom do you present your findings?
Sure. So I kind of describe what we do in the office in three separate buckets. So first are ones that are required by law. Like, by law, we have to audit all the federal money that comes into the state and do a single audit. We have to do the state financial statements and some other specific divisions that we're required to do every couple of years. So that sets one part of the schedule. The other would be some external force has compelled the auditor's office to do an audit. And so those are areas in which we don't have the discretionary authority. Like I said, municipalities, there has to be a petition of citizens. There could be a governor's request. And so those are things saying, hey, you don't have the direct authority to do it unless somebody requests you to do those. And so that's about another third or so of our work. The last third is discretionary. So things that we are able to audit in statute, but there's no time requirement to do so. So for instance, like TDDs or CIDs, we can audit those, but there is no time frame in which you have to do it. You just have the authority to do so if something pops up. You know, we have a whistleblower hotline, and so we get anonymous tips all the time into our whistleblower hotline, kind of saying, you know, we have this concern about local government, and we can either say, hey, we have these couple options for you if we don't have the authority. However, we take all that in, and so when we're making our discretionary decisions, we certainly consider what the whistleblower hotline is telling us, where people are concerned about what's happening in their state. To me, that's one way in which I'm directly accountable to the citizens for the work that we do in office. When we release an audit, it goes to the auditee. So a lot of people don't know too much about the audit process, so I'm just going to take a second to talk about that because I'm an auditor, so I find it interesting. So let's say we have a discretionary audit, right? So we're going to audit Department of Revenue, right? And so we have the discretionary authority under law to audit Department of Revenue, and we can do so. So we call them, we tell them, hey, we're going to do an audit. This is the scope of the audit. Let's set up an entrance meeting. who do we need to work with on your side to complete this audit and get information. So we sit down, we meet with them, we talk to them, then we get information, we conduct field work, then we wrap that up. We have a draft report that is sent to the auditee for them to look at, and we sit down and walk through the draft report in what's called an exit meeting to make sure that they understand the findings, but also to make sure that our information is accurate. I mean, we have had times where we've had huge violations of the sunshine law in here. You know, we're asking, are you sure you don't have any minutes? You really don't have any minutes or agendas? Well, when they see it in the report, it's like, oh, that's what you wanted. Okay, yeah, here, we got this stuff. So they provide us, we said, you know, okay, show me, you gotta show it to me. So, you know, they provide that information, and then we update our report because we want it to be accurate. So the auditee always sees the report well in advance of it being ever released to the public. Because it would be a disservice in the audit process if we were releasing inaccurate information, right? Because we didn't check with the auditee first. Then the auditee has 30 days to respond to the audit. Sometimes they take a week, sometimes they take all 30 days, you know, but they get that time period under the law. And then their responses are included within the audit. Then they get notified when the audit is going to be released, and then we release it. So we've also changed to an electronic process. Everything used to be either hand-delivered in a paper copy or mailed. And you can imagine when you release hundreds of audit reports, that's kind of expensive. We now just can send them, almost all of them, over email if they choose that. Most people choose that option. So that kind of saves and tightens up the audit process a little bit as well. Yes, sir.
How do we, who audits you, or how do we know? Not you particular, but you have a discretion. You have a lot of discretion on what you could audit, what maybe you don't audit, within reason. I mean, there's obviously some things that you'll have to audit, no matter how much you may not want to. But how do we know you're not picking and choosing certain topics to audit that maybe are a little more agenda-driven and not just, you know, an auditor?
Sure. So I mean, most of what we do falls into the realm of petition audits and required audits, right? The discretionary audits are the priority of the auditor. And, you know, what we're focused on here, as you can see, is you know, my singular focus is representing the taxpayers in the state. I don't represent Jefferson City. I don't represent City of Columbia. You know, I represent the citizens. And so that's the view of the lens in which I take. We are audited. So we're audited a couple different ways. You know, all of our audits have to go through a quality assurance program, and we have to meet Yellow Book auditing standards, right? And so the way that it works is there's an internal audit review. So we participate in this, and auditors and audit teams from across the country come in and take a look at our work and say, are you meeting auditing standards? Are you meeting the guidelines for which you need to accomplish your audits? And so we have, you know, the auditor's office has never had an issue there. We are having one on a rotating basis. This occurs, and so ours will start this fall. So we get that on a pretty regular basis. Secondly, we are audited by an independent CPA firm. So the legislature has the ability to call for the auditor's office to be audited every 2 years. Typically, they've done it every 4 years. They did pass something this session to allow us to be audited. So they go out through OA, they do a bidding process, they get an independent CPA firm, and the CPA firm basically does a performance audit on us to look to make sure that we're meeting our statutory responsibilities, you know, that we are doing all the things that we should do. And I think that's a really good thing. Again, that's another way in which I'm accountable to the citizens. You know, I will take a minute just to talk about one other thing on this one. You know, when I came into the auditor's office, you know, I cared a lot about the work of the office and the people there. And you know the circumstances in which I came into this position. It had been a long time from anybody turning the mirror on themselves within the auditor's office and saying, you know what, we hold people across the state to a very high standard. We should hold ourselves to that same high standard. And so we have taken that approach. We have changed policies. We have looked at our spending and our external contracts. We have taken a deep dive to say, you know what, when we pass judgment on others, we should pass that same judgment on ourselves. If we audited ourselves, would we pass? Would we get an excellent, or would we get a poor? I think that as the leader of the office is incredibly important. And I had a tremendous amount of buy-in from the auditors within the office. It's an exercise they actually ended up appreciating because it gave them confidence in the work that they were doing, that they were, building towards something, and it kind of brought us together a bit as a team.
Nicole, at this stage of your service in Jeff City, what would you point to as your biggest surprise so far?
I think that, my biggest surprise, just in this role, is the amount of people that are surprised when we catch them stealing money. Or really, yes, they are very clever, I don't know if anybody has taken a fraud class or an accounting class, but fraud detection 101, in the same position for 30 years, has never taken a vacation, will never allow someone to touch their work, has a luxury vehicle, and, has bought their kids' homes. And they work in a municipality of 10,000 people in southwest Missouri. And so, that is kind of surprising to me that they are surprised that, they have gotten figured out, and that, we have arrived at what they were doing. And, it is difficult, sometimes it's very difficult to catch fraud. Fraud exists and you cannot catch it all. That is not what auditing is. Auditing is sampling, it's interviews, it's walking through, it's finding opportunities, the fraud triangle that people talk about. So a lot of what we get when we catch these things are from whistleblowers. Whistleblowers contacting us and saying, something is not right here, you need to look at this. Whether they might be citizens or people inside the agency themselves.
What is the hardest part of it?
Yes.
Appreciate you clarifying what you have purview over and maybe what you don't. Some suggestions about things that it might make sense for you to be able to audit that is in the public interest and for good governance. You mentioned TDDs and the work that you've done there. Do you have oversight over tax increment financing arrangements, and is that something that you've been or what's your take?
So that's a really interesting question. So I have concerns about TIFs and tax increment financing because, they exist throughout the entire state, and there's different levels of attention paid to those across the state. I know that that's a topic that has been covered a lot here within Columbia. If you take a broader view, if you look in St. Louis and you look in Kansas City and other parts of the state, the concerns are not isolated to Columbia. Tax increment financing, or TIFs, are not a separate political subdivision. That's what makes them different. They exist under the municipality that created them. You have a TIF commission that might give advice to the municipality to create, or the governance structure of a TIF and how it works, but the ultimate accountability lies with the municipality or structure of political subdivision that created the TIF. That's the difference. So if we audit a municipality that has a TIF, we can audit the TIF, right? If let's say, the City of Columbia, if we're not auditing the City of Columbia, we cannot audit the TIFs that exist within their governance structure. TDDs, Transportation Development Districts, CIDs, Community Improvement Districts, those are political subdivisions. Those are public bodies that are taking in public dollars with a governance board and authority under statutes in order to operate. And so those are, since those are a separate political subdivision, those can be audited within the isolation of that particular TDD or CID. Does that make sense?
Well, Nicole, along those lines, you alluded earlier to a budget series that you wish to start tackling that would obviously examine the contribution of CIDs, TDDs, TIFs, the host of tax credits and things that all contribute to budget. Those are all political decisions, so how would you take all those political decisions, sacred cows, and try and find analytics and data on those since they're all political at their nape core anyway?
Well, I don't view those through a political lens. I view those through a budgetary and taxpayer lens, right? So if you have, so TDDs and CIDs are local level political subdivisions, and when we have done audits of TDDs or CIDs in the past through petitions or other mechanisms, as I was talking about, and found issues, right? So we found some issues in TDDs and said, hey, do these issues exist everywhere? Let's take a look. I don't know. I don't know what these look like statewide. That's where we had that TDD audit that had $1 billion, and we found abuses, especially within the St. Louis area, abuses of TDDs. So that's something, that's how the decision to audit TDDs came about in that broad sense, which led us to the conclusion we need a legislative fix here. When it comes to tax credits or tax exemptions, the fiscal note process, those have direct consequences on the budget. We have a $500 million budget hole next year. And when we think about, if we take a step back, so take a step back and think about our budget a little bit. So our general revenue, which is the discretionary funding of this state, where we do K-12 education, higher education, where we can decide what to do with the money as policymakers. Back in the 90s, about 50% of that came from individual income taxes. Now it's 70%. So that means our discretionary revenue is basically funded from what comes out of your paychecks, right? Your individual income taxes. When we have a $500 million budget hole, and throughout the state we have basically full unemployment. We know that our unemployment rate here in Boone County is low. In some parts of the state it is higher. I don't want to give the impression that everywhere in the state is like Boone County, but let's take Boone County here specifically. When you have low unemployment and a budget that is based on individual income taxes, and we have a $500 million budget hole, how are we going to fill that? Are we going to get down to 1% unemployment and then growing the revenue taken in by the state through individual income taxes? Can we? Is that possible? I don't know. That's what we're looking at. So if you're looking at how the revenue is coming in, you also need to look at the spending side. That's tax credits, tax exemptions. That's huge entitlement programs like Medicaid and prescription drugs. And I think it would be false to say that there are no available efficiencies in the Medicaid program or prescription drugs that would help save us money in the long term. And so when we look at the big cost drivers, whether it is uncomfortable to have the conversation about our revenue and spending, whether it's viewed as political, I don't believe that it is, but if it's viewed as political, too bad, because we have to have an honest conversation. And when we have a $500 million budget hole and money is being taken out of our schools and higher education and things that matter in communities, we need to have an honest policy conversation about it. I'm passionate on that one.
Well, I've dabbled with it a lot, and as much as you want it to be data-driven, you want it to be a public policy decision, these are all sacred cows. And the chamber is the biggest temple of sacred cows that you will ever find. We love all the tax credits, and they're all targeted, and they all have a benefit that we're supposed to reap that's supposed to drive our economy. But you're right, you go back to the 90s, none of these were made in huge steps. They've all been made in very small, incremental things that have become highly entrenched throughout the entire state from top to bottom in both parties. So that's why I'm rather skeptical that you can apply analytics to it. We could see what has happened, but the solutions are off the chart stuff.
There's no doubt about it that the solutions are difficult. If you take a broad view and look at the data, and there's a lot of numbers floating around there, and some of them are accurate, some of them are inaccurate. We're still in the midst of this, so I don't have any predetermined solutions here because we're still in the middle of this audit. It would be disingenuous to try and have a solution before I have all the information. But you have to start somewhere. Do we just say it's too hard and not do it when, I just don't think that that's the right lens in order to view this problem. Certainly there should be a public debate about how we spend our money. That's what policy making is. that's, and if it's uncomfortable and you have to ask hard questions, that's my job as state auditor. That's why people want an independent office, and that's why we do things driven by the data and the decisions and the information that comes to us, to then start that conversation in the public space.
I'd love to visit with you.
Well, to follow up on that a little bit, what are you looking for then if you audit, let's say, if an audit that you're doing gets into tax credit programs? Are you looking for a return on the tax credit program? Is that part of the scope of the audit, or are you just not looking for anything and just, wondering if something might pop out that might be a, policy suggestion that might?
Sure. So when we do audits, we look specifically at a couple things. We look for, first of all, we look for compliance with the law. Are these, let's say, tax credits, or in this instance, the subject here, tax credits, issued in accordance with the law? Is the cost benefit forms that are submitted to DED, Department of Economic Development, are those complete and accurate? Are they compiling the information accurately and providing that information to policymakers? Are policymakers working within the bounds of the law when they have to approve these things and go forward? So there's some just compliance issues that we do in every audit, is it in compliance with the law. Then we look at local policies and procedures. So does DED have policies and processes for tax credit issuance, for the accuracy of the data, for the information? In this particular one for tax credits, these are so complicated that we spent some time explaining the background on these things. I mean, there's carry forward periods, there's tails on these things. So even if you were to say today, I mean, this is a factual statement, that has nothing to do with the audit. Factual statement, if you cut all tax credit programs today, you would not fill next year's budget hole, right? Because they have carry forward periods and they have tails in which that they can address, and they're all different. Every single one of them are a little different. There's also sunset provisions that are different, and so this is a complicated thing to look at this overall. DED also has some responsibility for collecting cost-benefit information. We're taking a look at the process there. Are they really capturing the cost-benefit of these programs, and are they applying it consistently? I think that's a fair question to ask. And so that's where a lot of this is going. We have taken deep dives into tax credit programs in the past. Every auditor, I think, ever, since there has been the existence of tax credit programs, have audited tax credit programs. They've looked at LIHTC, low-income housing, they've looked at historic preservation, they've looked at quality jobs programs, and what I have seen over and over again is that we have taken hours and hours and hours of audit time, come back with very specific findings and recommendations, presented it to the General Assembly, presented it to the administration, whoever that might be at the time, and there has been no change, right? Kind of what you're talking about, there has been no change. So those were singularly focused, driven on a specific program. Let's wrap our arms around all of that and look at the bigger picture and what it means for the budget and stated tax credits in our state, the cost benefit of those. And that's what we're wrapping our arms around in that section of the Budget Integrity Series audit. I think I'm supposed to wait to see if there's anybody else that has questions first.
But what you just said, doesn't that kind of hinge on what he was asking you about policy versus politics?
See, I don't know about that. I mean, if you look at, there has not been a report issued from the auditor's office that has looked at all of them in totality and the impact on the budget in totality. There has been singularly focused on certain programs and the efficiencies of certain programs, but not all together in one place.
Is there a possibility that as you look, you're going to get into the areas he was asking you about?
I don't know. We're not through the audit yet, so that's not something that I can say.
Time for one more.
Do you ever get to deliver good news?
Yes, I do. Carroll County got an excellent. That is the first time a county has ever received an excellent. And I went up there and met with the county clerk and the county commission, and we had a mini celebration. It is a huge feat for how they run their county that they got an excellent on a report. And there are times that I do get to deliver excellent news. particularly when there's progress. And, you know, there's, sometimes we've had instances where people have gotten, or auditees have gotten a core, and they have worked really hard, they've asked a lot of questions, they check in with us, and their next audit they get a good. They have tangible things that they can hang their hat on, that they have changed to better serve their citizens, and I do celebrate that, and always point it out, talk to the press about it, whether they cover it or not, I don't know. But I do celebrate those things, because that is a lot of hard work that goes behind trying to do good for your citizens, and I get that.
Very small one.
Very
How
small.
big is your staff?
We have about 115 people, and with about 90 or so auditors.
Well, thank you again. Let's give a round of applause. And let's give another round of applause to our sponsor, Dave Griggs Flooring America. All right, a couple things we've got going on. So again, we're going to be doing this our next program year. So those that don't know, our program year is July to June. So we're right at the end of our program year this year. So appreciate you making it. David, again, thank you, and thanks for stepping up again next year. We look forward to partnering with you again. So a couple things I want to announce to you, 3 things real fast. If you haven't done so, please register and attend the reception with Secretary of State Jay Ashcroft over at Logboat Brewing Company next week, which is Tuesday, May the 23rd from 4 p.m. From 4 to 5:30 p.m. over at Logboat. If you haven't made reservations, please do so. Our next Government Affairs Committee meeting will be held on Thursday, June the 1st at 4 p.m. We'll be recapping the 2017 legislative session as it is coming to an end. And then we will be continuing again these luncheons starting in November. We have invited Missouri House Budget Chairman Scott Fitzpatrick, U.S. Senator Claire McCaskill, and Attorney General Josh Hawley, and Governor Eric Greitens are the ones that we have reached out to so far. 2 of the 4 have already been confirmed, so please continue to support. We're not going to tell you who, so it'll be a surprise. So please continue to support the lunch. Hope to see you here. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.